You know, when I was younger, and a lot of you, we were much more interesting than we are now. In the 1950s, people were really interesting. They had an unconscious, they had ideas about themselves which reached well beyond the numerical and the objective, and that's how we lived our lives. And it wasn't just physicians. As a matter of fact, physicians were a little behind in the whole thing. Departments of psychiatry were most commonly psychoanalytic departments at that time. Certainly Cornell was, and patients went into therapy in New York City and Los Angeles. That's not the United States, of course, but in high numbers. Well, that's all gone. And somehow I ask you, I'm not sure where the unconscious went. I don't know whether you look for it under a rock or if you read old books or something like that. But the interesting thing to us is it went away because subjectivity went away. Subjectivity lost its value. In science, which is now a social movement. Don't think science is just a thing that scientists do. It's now a social way the world is viewed. Objective information has value. Subjective information doesn't have value. Knowledge does the work, not people. And evidence-based medicine is the latest incarnation of that. That if you practice evidence-based medicine, your patients will do well because you're working on an evidence base. Of course, there isn't a person in this room who doesn't believe that it's proper to have good evidence, but there isn't a person in this room who's in palliative care who thinks that that's the end of treatment. That's the beginning. That's where it starts. That's not where it ends. And so we have a problem as a field. We have a problem. We live in a subjective world. We take care of people where feelings matter. We take care of people where illnesses, no matter how scientifically described they are illnesses of subjectivity, of people's feelings, of their relationship of each other to the others in their family and so forth, none of which are described numerically particularly well. And they're not even described in language particularly well because that whole endeavor stopped for a while. Now, it didn't stop everywhere, of course, and there are people doing work, and David's lecture attends to that. But we have to understand that we do a work where subjectivity is vitally important. So I would like to start, if I can, with the fact that we deal with sick persons. And I want to just sing a song again that I sing again and again and again, but I want you to have a different way of evaluating that person in front of you. We're used to starting with the disease and thinking in terms of the disease, its stage, numbers, specific therapies, and of course we have to do that, and that's the great, wonderful advance that has come from the science of the 20th and 21st centuries, because if it were not for the disease, the patient would not be a patient. And in fact, also, we've come to understand about the disease not only its presence, but that some people die and some people live, and the people who live, we call them survivors. A lot of other people call them alive, but we call them particularly survivors. And why is that important? Because we begin to believe that those numbers, the percent survival and so forth, are what count. Now, you can't look at David's lecture and see the differences between people who are depressed or have poor family support or no family support and so forth in their mortality from people who are better adjusted, happier, get along well with their family and so forth, and then go back to some study like David Spiegel's study where the difference is minor. They didn't survive even though he thought they did, and everybody loved that study until they looked closely. Well, it can't be. You can't have both of them. Either it's bad for you to be divorced, alone, live in the 5th floor, not have enough money, and no education, or it's not. And if it is, some of those things are amenable to treatment. And if they're amenable to treatment and they make no difference in the outcome of the person's disease, something is wrong in the understanding of what's happening to those persons. And we deal with what's happening to that person in sickness and as they're dying. So there's no conflict between understanding the disease is why this person is in front of us and understanding the numbers, but actually that person's in bed, ill, or whatever words you want, because of impairments of function, because of what they can't do, or the things that are impaired about their life, and things, one or many, that keep them from accomplishing their goals and purposes. That's how you know you're sick. You may go looking for an explanation in disease, but you know to start looking because you can't do what you want to do. You woke up in the morning and you're not as functional as you were the morning before. Of course, on that basis, most of us would be in bed a good number of days of the year. And sure, it may be the disease causes those functional losses. In fact, it mostly does. The inability to get out of bed, walk, talk, interact with the family, go to work, have sex, think, read, write. But it's the impairments of function themselves that make the patient know that he or she is sick. And because each of us is different, which purpose and goal are most important differs. It sure is a noisy. My mother was in the intensive care unit and discovered that she could make the monitor bleep by hitting her chest. She started to play tunes the best she could with it. Because each of us are different, which purposes and goals matter the most to us is individual. And if that's the case, which impairments of function are most important to us is also individual. All of which is a very complicated way of saying is that when you look at sickness this way, in terms of function and in terms of purposes and goals, you are being patient-centered. Since function is something we know about professionally, medically, focusing on what functions the person's lost and may need to accomplish for what is important to the person is both person-centered and medical at the same time without reaching at all. In other words, when we care about why that person is sick in the person's terms, we have a medical task in front of us and we are being person-centered. This does not change the importance of disease. It does not diminish the importance of scientific knowledge of pathophysiology. It just puts it to the side and gives you the point of it all. Why do we want to know? What are we after? It focuses on something different, what disease does in terms of this particular patient's life. And there, where we should also be looking and suffering. Looking and acting. Now, suffering is one of the things that happens to our patients. There are some things about suffering, which is an old term. Theodicy is the study in religions of how religions cope with the problem of suffering, which has occupied humankind from the beginning of time. Why do people suffer? Why is suffering allowed? Why does a loving God allow suffering? Well, that's not our problem, but my problem is, why do trained medical professionals allow suffering in the patients that are in front of them? First and foremost, suffering is a thing itself. It's not another thing. Suffering is suffering. It is suffering and not something else. Suffering is not pain or the other symptoms that caused it. Suffering is suffering. Despite this, again and again, you'll hear people speak as though the physical stimulus is the suffering. Oh, he's suffering from terrible pain. No, his terrible pain started the suffering. And as a matter of fact, once the suffering starts in that person, the suffering becomes prominent, and the pain, even though it continues, will diminish. You can remove the pain, and you may not stop the suffering. There are also not different kinds of suffering. There is just suffering. People talk about existential suffering as though the category where the person is suffering by virtue of his or her unbearable existence. It just occurs to me I'm talking too fast just because of that thing. That's the clock. It goes, you can watch the seconds go by, and if you have, time desperation, it's really difficult. It's like when, thank you very much. I don't have to worry about when it's over, because there's always somebody over there who'll tell you when it's over. You hear about existential suffering, and included in this category is often psychological suffering. The person is suffering because of psychological something, grief or something like that. These kinds of suffering, it is said, are distinct from physical suffering. Of course, the beauty of that is, if that's the case, then it's all right to use terminal sedation for somebody who has physical suffering, but it's not all right to do it for somebody who has existential suffering or psychological suffering. Now, all of you have you ever seen anybody who had anything that was purely psychological, of any duration or severity, that didn't affect their body, that didn't have something to do with whether they ate or slept well, or how they talked, or how they interacted with other people? No. At least not in the kinds of people that we see. And did you ever see anybody who couldn't stand their unbearable existence, but their bodies were just keen, and they were just as good basketball players as they were the day before, except that they had existential suffering? It's ridiculous. We're of a piece. If you learn nothing else, if there's no word that I say that we're of a piece. What happens to one part of us happens to the all. It cannot be otherwise. Otherwise, you'd have to see little barriers, across the thing. There'd be one here for the mind-body. We're of a piece. What happens to one part happens to the all. What happens to the whole happens to every single part. No, there's only suffering. When pain is the stimulus to suffering is suffering. When emotional issues are the stimulus, it's suffering, not terrible fear. When existence is unbearable and it starts suffering, it's suffering. So when you confront the suffering patient, call it what it is. Incidentally, depression itself, demoralization itself, may be reasons for suffering. Because what suffering is a breakdown in the intactness of the person as the person knows themselves. And demoralization or depression may indeed do that. Depressed patients who say, this is not me, I'm not this way. I've got things to do, I can't be like this. But in point of fact, they are like that, and if it goes on long enough, it breaks down the fabric of personhood. There is such a thing as your personhood. And you know it. You know it for sure when it gets injured. Some suffering is worse and some is lesser. But suffering is suffering. And once suffering starts, as I say, the primary problem begins to recede, and suffering is the problem. It is possible to relieve suffering even if the stimulus continues. It is possible to relieve suffering even if pain is the source and the pain continues. The essential truth that suffering has to teach all of us is that suffering happens to persons, not to bodies. Suffering always involves a sense of the future. Bodies have no sense of the future. Suffering involves meaning. Bodies don't have a sense of meaning. Only persons suffer. The central truth is persons suffering. Suffering is a specific distress that occurs when persons feel their intactness and integrity as persons threatened or disintegrating, and it continues until the threat is gone or intactness or integrity are restored. key word is person. So what is a person? Well, you know, it's very interesting. My colleague at McGill, Don Boudreau, and I, going around looking what, you know, we're trying to change the curriculum. You know, curricular change is somewhat more difficult than stopping earthquakes. Because in curricular change, you have to change the faculty. Fortunately, that's not my problem. I gave up already on changing faculties, but the fact is that everybody calls their schools and their hospitals person-centered, but nobody has a course in what a person is. There is not a single medical school with a course on what is a person. And we don't teach about diseases of the liver without telling you what a liver is. Of course, most of you know it's over on this side, not on this side, and so forth. Although occasionally. But the point is, a person is the object of our care. We may work through bodies, but we take care of persons. You can't not. So it seems reasonable to know what is a person. The short version is, a person is an embodied, purposeful, thinking, feeling, emotional, reflective, relational, very complex human individual of a certain temperament existing through time in a narrative sense, whose life in all spheres points outward and inward, and who does things. Now, I understand that that's impossible, but the point is, its complexity is what's the point. Even the part about life in all spheres points outward and inward. You do nothing outward that isn't reflected inward. We know a lot about outward and not nearly as much about inward. Even thinking, which was a source of great importance to the ancients, rational thought, is just beginning to come back in as a subject of study. You're just beginning to see books about intuition and so forth. So the idea of person is a complex one. Persons live at all times in a context of relationships with others and with the self. Even your dreams almost inevitably involve others. When we speak of the intactness or integrity of a person, we mean that a person in all of those complex parts is complete or has a completeness. You can't take persons apart to study them, because the minute you take them apart, they're not a person anymore. You take a part off the body and it's still a body. The person has changed, but the body is still a body. For the same reason, once again, whatever happens to one part happens to the whole. Now, what does it mean to say that suffering occurs when the intactness or integrity of the patient is lost or threatened? So I've put together 4 brief scenarios that illustrate the concept. And I think you'll understand the episodes, but I think you'll also recognize the patients, even though the character descriptions of the last 3 are only a sentence long. I don't need your clock. I have my own clock. I know it. What if you've been tolerating pain for hours and hours and days and it never stops? And now you're exhausted because you haven't been able to sleep, and you've tried so hard not to cry and call out to every passing nurse or doctor, and they don't stop anyway because they're too busy for you. And it goes on and on. And you finally have no stamina left at all, nothing, and no control. And you just start to whimper. And you don't even hear yourself, because there is no yourself anymore. There's just pain. What if you've been really proud of your appearance? I mean, beautiful, beautiful. And really a careful dresser. Nothing by chance. Maybe for 100 years. And then lately you've been having diarrhea, terrible diarrhea all the time, for days and days on end. And they won't give you anything to stop it because, well, you're not sure why. And when you finally come into the hospital, the nurse undresses you standing up. There's shit running down your legs and on your clothes and everywhere. And people come in and out of your room. What if you've always been a good patient, like a good child, and tried hard to do everything they asked you to do because you've always been good, even when you were a child and people always used to say how special you were? And then you came to the emergency room because this time you're really sick and you've been lying on a gurney for 10 hours waiting for a bed. And you're not sure what's happening and you're so thirsty and so cold for hours, but nobody helps. And when they do stop, they tell you how busy they are and to try and be patient. And when you try and find out what's happening, nobody listens. And some are just mean and short, and you're so cold. What if you've always been really social and have a million friends because you love social stuff? And what if you just found out last week that you had cancer in your colon? You'll recognize this lady. You just found out you have cancer in your colon and they couldn't operate because it's in your liver. And you're sure you're going to die soon. And you're afraid to tell anyone because they'll stop talking to you like they did when your mother was dying. When everybody ran away from her and from you and left you to take care of her alone. And that was awful. And you don't even tell your girls because, they have their own lives. And you're really scared, terribly terrified of dying. Now, these are abbreviated because this is a lecture. But these are recognizable people and possibly the possible source of the disruption or threat to the integrity or their intactness should be recognizable also. The fact that they suffer is not just because of the stimulus, because they are the specific persons they are. That's what it means to say suffering is personal. We say that meaning plays a part in suffering because in each of these scenarios, certainly the last three, it's not just the stimulus that matters, but what it means. Not what it means in Viktor Frankl's sense. Their meaning is purpose. This is what it means in the old-fashioned sense of what does it signify. If you looked it up in the dictionary, what does it mean? That kind of meaning. In fact, it's the meaning to the person, personal meaning, that makes it a source of suffering. Liquid feces running down your legs is never nice. But to that fastidious woman who's so vain, it is beyond horrible. It's never nice to be abandoned on a gurney, though. It happens all the time. But if you've always been so very good and special, it feels unfair and abusive, like it's being done on purpose. And being separated from others is always bad, but if you've been really, really social and isolation is threatened, that's terrible. The fear of death may be mostly the fear of being separated from the group, and so on. Now, healing these patients, choosing the goal in the suffering patient comes because what do we know about what's always present in suffering? There's a cause, a reason, or a stimulus. There's a person who's susceptible to suffering because of who that person is. The person is unique and individual. There is something about this person that makes him or her uniquely liable to suffer, given a source. There's self-conflict, which, given an appropriate source, may precipitate suffering. Self-conflict. Conflict within the self. There's a loss of purpose. There's loss of purpose. And there's loneliness and social isolation. First of all, above all, wherever possible, the stimulus of suffering should be removed. There is no excuse. You don't have to say it here. There is no excuse for untreated pain. There's no excuse. But that's not the end. It's only the beginning. Because the physical symptom that you believe to be the source may be completely controlled and the suffering continue. In the cases I gave you, pain is the source of suffering in only one of them. In the second is the feeling of being abused. In the third is the serious injury to self-image. And in the fourth is social isolation. So even if the physical symptom is relieved, the suffering may continue. On the other hand, suffering can be relieved even if the physical symptoms continue. You see, we're not used to intervening in the person, although we do it all the time, because you cannot intervene in any part of the person without intervening in the person. But all the interventions, wherever directed on the person, happens to the whole person. In healing the suffering person, you must intentionally act on that person. To do that requires understanding what suffering involves, what is present in all suffering. What is it about this person that makes him or her particularly liable to suffering given the situation? Another way to ask the question is, what is it about this person's identity, self-identity, that makes them liable to disintegrate given the source? The person who knows herself always to be good and special and is abandoned on a gurney has been injured. The person who has always been proud of her vanity is actively injured by being soiled with feces and being seen that way. The clinician can recognize that aspect of the person and direct it specifically. Self-conflict should be recognized. Wanting to give up because of the unendurable suffering, but wanting to be alive. Wanting to be alive, but not wanting to live the only life that seems possible. At a certain point, it isn't life that matters. What matters is what matters. The personal things that matter. It's not being alive. It's what matters to you, your relationship. The source of self-conflict can be discovered and the resolution of the conflict attempted. All suffering involves the loss of central purpose, the purpose of being me. I'm not about me anymore. I'm about my belly button. I'm about my pain. I'm about lying here and nobody comes. And because purpose means intentions, goals, the object for which things are done, purpose pervades all. Every moment of life is filled with purpose, all joining together, as I said before, to be oneself. And how do we solve these things? We re-engage persons in the pursuit of goals. We find small goals, and we take the small goal and enlarge it. We find getting out of bed. We find just finishing that, so you don't have to eat it. I mean, I'm not your mother. You don't have to eat the whole bowl. But let's sit up and talk and let's eat. After all, that's what people do. And then the next day a little more, and then the next day a little more. All suffering is lonely. Lonely. Lonely because of suffering, as suffering is usually unrecognized. Incidentally, in the painting of the family, you go back and look at that painting, the patient is really alone. When you go look at her, she's really alone. Lonely because the suffering is usually unrecognized. Lonely because the suffering is personal. Lonely. Loneliness in patients should always be addressed, not only in suffering patients. All of this is possible to the extent that you personally connect to the patient and reach across the space. Let's go back for just a moment in these last moments to those patients. The patient in pain has been reduced to a pitiable, whimpering object. Do you think that memory will ever go away unless you actively change it, try to change the meaning of it, to make them brave, not abandoned, to make them brave for having been there that many hours and still being able to do it, and so forth? Do you think the good and special person who's been humiliated on the gurney, who felt humiliated, will ever ever go away unless you change its meaning. Or the lady who's suffering because of the feces running down her leg. Picture that for yourself. You have to show her. First of all, make sure she's cleaned up and make sure that nobody comes in and out of that room anymore. That's nobody's business but that patient. And then what you do with that patient changes it. You see that? You can't hide it. There they go. There it goes. If you understand that that's your role, that reaching across and making those things happen for patients, that's your role. That's your role, not the numbers. The numbers are important, but that's your role. If you understand that, and you know that you're only able to do that because of who you are, because of your training, because of your ability to be at that bedside, because the patient expects that of you, that you, just like that patient, is a special individual and particular person, and because of that, you're able to reach across and make that pay. And if you understand how important it is to expand your understanding of your role and the nature of the clinician's job, so that you see that as your primary mission, there should be no unrelieved suffering in the patients for whom you care. Thank you.